goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts for $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
Welcome to the virtual summit on ethics in sports, where we ask, what is sportsmanship? And how does it differ from gamesmanship? And what is the relationship between sportsmanship, an athlete's character, and society? We will consider how to draw the line between sportsmanship and gamesmanship and determine the ethical and social aspects of drawing the line in different places. After considering some suggestions on how to manage gamesmanship, we will consider what sports does for character when sports is done well.
Seven years ago, as a result of a gamesmanship activity, we decided to conceive National Sportsmanship Day. I attended a high school basketball game in Connecticut. The coach of one of the teams was a dear friend of mine, is a dear friend of mine. We'd grown up together in Massachusetts, and he was experiencing his first losing season. It was at the end of the game. In a game, I mean, every game is meaningful, but this was not a game that was going to involve his team making the tournament. They were out of the tournament for the first time in 11 years. And with about 30 seconds to go, a player on the opposing team dribbled the ball up the floor and charged into a player on my friend's team. And as his team was walking up to shoot the foul shot, the other end of the court, I noticed my friend use some kind of a hand signal. And then I noticed that instead of the young man who had been fouled walking to the foul line, who I found out later shot about 46% from the foul line, the young man who shot about 85% at the foul line was taking the foul shots. He hit the two foul shots, my friend's team won, and we went out after and we talked. We ended up talking for about 4 hours, and it became an emotional discussion. I said to him, I said, you know, I'm not a moral IRS agent, and I certainly had too many technical fouls to judge anyone, but I said, Chris, in effect, you cheated to win that game. And this was a very tough guy, and he actually broke down. And he said, you know, the pressures have gotten to me, and I can't believe that I would have done this. And I said, but in doing it, you must have planned it. And he said, I did plan it. He said, we talked about it in practice a couple of weeks ago. The result of that discussion was a dialogue that was very profound for me. And at the end of it, we both came to the same conclusion that I had coached at the college level for 9 years. He had been a high school coach for 13 years. Neither one of us had ever attended a clinic or had ever engaged in any kind of a meaningful discussion on the issue of sportsmanship.
The death of ethics is the sabotage of excellence. And so once you step out and do, for instance, cheating, right, then what it does is debases the whole game. The whole game is set up in order for you to follow these rules for creative self-expression in order to develop yourself. Well, if you cheat, then that's not a means of developing yourself.
And the trends that we have definitely found at the college level in examining Division I men, Division III men, and Division I women and Division III women. Let me give you some examples. My teammates would expect me to cheat if it meant the difference in winning a game. Division I and Division III women both came in at about 13% in agreement with that statement. Division III men came in at nearly 27%. Division I men came in at nearly 50%. That's been the trend in all of our research, that Division III and Division I women seem to adhere to the values of sportsmanship in a far more compelling way than their counterparts at the Division III level in men's basketball, and certainly at the Division I level in men's basketball.
I would define gamesmanship as the art and science of gaining a strategic advantage, trying to win, through morally questionable means. That's what it is to be a good gamesman. You're technically legal. Nobody can point a finger and say, you broke the game rules. Sportsmanship, I think, has two aspects to it. First, it involves a duty to treat others in the sport environment, I would just say with respect, including opponents, including game officials, two that get the brunt of a lot of bad behavior these days. And then a second part of it would be a refusal to seek unfair advantage over opponents in the contest. And with Dan, I would agree that this includes an unbinding commitment to follow the written rules, and it also involves some interpretation of what we usually call the spirit of the rules.
I'm Bill Shelton, the president of Eastern Michigan University, and served on the NCAA President's Commission and also chaired the NCAA Committee on Sportsmanship and Ethical Conduct in Intercollegiate Athletics several years ago. Just a quick background on that. In 1990, the then executive director of the NCAA, Richard Schultz, challenged the convention to demonstrate to the rest of the academic community and to the general public that college sports could be effectively controlled. Everyone gives lip service to sportsmanship, but when you got down to exact definitions and responsibilities and which behaviors were sportsmanlike and which were behaviors that we didn't think were right, a great deal of variation. I spoke at one of the national coaching conventions during this time, and this discussion came up as to what's the difference between what the players on the basketball floor did in terms of taunting and celebrating as opposed to what was something that should be going on, and there was a very positive reinforcement. And there was a great variation even among the coaches as to how you define the difference in what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. So everybody said, yes, we believe in sportsmanship, but then the question is, well, what do you really mean by sportsmanship, and how do we judge and evaluate it?
Victory is our goal. But there's a tension between two ways of pursuing victory, one that respects the established process and the other participants, and one that fundamentally disrespects them. Gamesmanship is the desire to win through any means necessary. It is the elevation of victory to the status of ultimate goal. The concept of sportspersonship or sportsmanship expresses the other side of that tension. The good sportsperson also pursues a victory and can pursue it just as strenuously as any other competitor, but it does so in a way that exemplifies respect, both for one's co-competitors and the fundamental values of the sport.
I come from Penn State, where Joe Paterno resides. And for whether rightly or wrongly, sometimes the media depict Joe Paterno as a model, an ethical model. This is the way college football should be, and this is the way a college football coach should act, and so forth. And I don't have the time to talk about the details of that. I am a fan of Joe Paterno, and I do think that it's largely an accurate picture. Some naysayers will say to a coach like Joe Paterno, he can afford to be ethical because he's been so successful, he can recruit the athletes, and so he's one of the few coaches who can, quote unquote, afford to be ethical. Other coaches who don't have that reputation can't afford it. The thing that worries me as an ethicist is that we often excuse people from doing the right thing as soon as we find there's a cost to it. My understanding of ethics is that there is often a cost to doing the right thing. For you and me, when we pay our taxes, there's a cost if we pay every cent, or when we tell the truth, when it's perhaps not convenient, and so forth. And so I worry about the argument that coaches can't be ethical because they're under pressure and there are costs. There are always costs to doing, not always, there are often costs to doing the right thing, for coaches too.
The final piece of the strategic plan was to focus on sportsmanship, which we believed was the Rock of Gibraltar in terms of intercollegiate athletics. It was the piece that somehow made all the other parts of intercollegiate athletics meaningful and come together. Now, we've heard a lot of definitions about sportsmanship and gamesmanship here today, and certainly I realize that we can go in different directions. Our committee defined the role of sportsmanship in this manner. Sportsmanship creates the moral framework, ethical content, and balanced perspective for winning and losing. Well, that was a beautiful definition of the responsibility of sportsmanship, but you see, we've talked all day about winning. No longer can there be a balanced perspective and ethical content if you don't assume that there's the other side, and that is losing.
That's why I approach this from the perspective of moral reasoning. You know, when we talk about being a good sport, we can all come up with our own particular virtues, our favorite things about, and usually that reflect our own character, what we strive to do. But we can talk about moral reasoning in a more general sense, how we think about what's right or wrong or good or bad. And so our program at the University of California at Berkeley has been designed to implement programs both with youth sport and with children at risk and physical education programs, trying to promote moral reasoning development within the context of sport.
There is clearly a problem in determining the ethics of gamesmanship as well as the obligations of good sportsmanship. Athletes, coaches, fans, and institutions alike often have differences of opinion regarding appropriate or necessary behavior. Dan Doyle shared his unsettling experience with gamesmanship that led him to found the National Sportsmanship Day and investigate unethical behavior in sports. Jan Boxell pointed out that cheating in sports, however that is defined, destroys the basis for sports competition. Scott Kretschmeyer defined sportsmanship and gamesmanship and stressed the need for the desire to play within both the letter and the spirit of the rules of sport. Bill Shelton reported on his work as chair of the NCAA Committee on Sportsmanship and recalled the difficulties the committee faced trying to achieve agreement on what constitutes sportsmanship and gamesmanship. Brenda Bredemeyer identified the tension between the drive for victory and the ideal of sportsmanship, and she pointed out how she teaches moral reasoning in an attempt to assist her athletes in making good moral choices in sports. As we have just seen, sports managers, coaches, and administrators, like many of us in this complex society, confront situations where each option requires an ethical analysis before a decision should be made. What is within the rules? What is beyond the rules' intent? And what is a violation of the spirit of the rules? These can be difficult questions, especially when winning and losing are on the line. Let's now consider how some of our experts suggest that we manage aspects of the sportsmanship and character development issues.
I believe, at least on the intercollegiate athletic level, we have way too many rules. We have just continued to put additional rule after rule after rule into effect. And what it does, it literally gets to the point that the only issue is if there's not a rule against it, that it's okay to do. And then that's the automatic assumption by virtue of having so many rules. In a publication in 1994, and you may or may not agree with this conclusion, but the writer said NCAA policy has become so rule-dependent, so comprehensive, and so situation-specific that athletic administrators, coaches, and support staff under its auspices are increasingly not required to make ethical judgments. Outside the world of athletics, in the early 90s, a university, through a grant program, there was attention called to some indirect costs that were related to it and some things. And the president, who was a person that I had always respected, when he was asked by a member of the media, why did this happen? And the answer was, well, there was no rule prohibiting it. And I think that's the challenge, that probably we spend so much time with nitpicking about the little rules in athletics. We need to get rid of most of them so that we can come back to the point of actually having moral reasoning going on in some of the decision making.
What I would say is that a person often needs to put at risk their opportunity to win in order to act in a way that they believe is right. And I think that's why we see less and less of this kind of behavior as sport becomes more professionalized. And I would say that many intercollegiate activities are professionalized, sometimes even at the high school level. And so that's why we focus on youth sport and any other sport organization that really believes and lives out its commitment to educational sport. If we want sport to build character, we have to be willing to risk success for something that the institution believes is of greater value. And right now at the intercollegiate level and the professional level, for the most part, the highest value is winning.
There's nothing wrong with winning. There's nothing wrong with demanding winning. But it's all a matter of definition of winning, within what parameters, at what cost, and then trying to find a set of standards that are acceptable to most of the participants, and then to learn how to abide by those with honor and dignity for all concerned. Now that's easy to talk about and very difficult to find, but I think that you ought to be expected to win. At the same time, I think you ought to be expected to follow every single rule all the time. At the same time, I think you ought to be expected to be sure that every single player who will work at it earns a diploma, becomes educated, and I mean a real education, a diploma that actually prepares her or him to compete in the marketplace. And I think all of those things are possible, but a lot of things have to be present in order for that to happen.
Individuals, when they live together in a group over a period of time, develop a shared understanding of how to behave. And part of that includes their interpretation of the rules. And part of it involves their interpretation of what's appropriate given those rules. And I want to share an example. We did a study of 150 youth sports soccer players. They were in a girls' soccer league, a pretty high level of competition. And we studied the different reasons that they were tempted to lie to an official, to cheat, or to hurt an opponent. And we found that the best predictor of these girls cheating, lying, or hurting an opponent, what we might call unfair behavior, the best predictor was their perception of whether or not their teammate would engage in that behavior. It wasn't any of the other personal attributes that we assessed. It wasn't their moral reasoning maturity. It wasn't their motivational orientation. It wasn't their level of competitiveness. It wasn't their class. It wasn't anything that you might imagine. It was their perception of their opponent's willingness to cheat, lie, or hurt an official. That's what I mean by moral atmosphere. The shared belief that something is okay or not okay, the collective norms that help guide people's behaviors.
If a child gets into a team sport, and naturally I focused on football, that was my sport, that child can learn so many great things if properly coached. And that's a big if. And the coach has to really work at these things, but a child can learn to have singleness of purpose, whether it's the educational or the athletic process. A youngster can learn to be unselfish, to participate in a team context, to accept, not just tolerate, but to accept people who are different from him or her. A child can learn real toughness, which is not trash talk, and not a lot of the garbage we see coming out of the television these days, or the newspapers. Toughness is to take responsibility when that is difficult. Toughness is to never make an excuse. Toughness is to always do what you're supposed to do to the very best of your ability. That is toughness, whether it's making a tackle in the fourth quarter at the goal line, or whether it's showing up at 6 a.m. for a tough physics tutorial session. You do what you're supposed to do. You can learn that in the context of team sports if the coach makes you learn it. A young person can learn how to prepare. I mean, how to prepare for life, really, in a team context. You go on that practice field day after day after day. Football is a very demanding sport. You can't even survive on the team and be a member without paying a tremendous price. So you learn that preparation and being smart about knowing your business. And when you can do that, you can compete in the real world. That's education. And then finally, I think the most important lesson of all that one learns in team sport is that you never give up, ever. You just don't quit. And if you can learn that one and hang on to the others, and if there's somebody there who lives that out every day, a coaching staff, then I think a real contribution has been made to the lives of those youngsters.
But when sports works well, it does a number of things for us. One of them is that there's an old, I went to a Jesuit school, so there's an old Jesuit motto about a sound mind and a sound body. And indeed, I think it's absolutely right that part of the way in which we achieve harmony within ourselves and with other people is that sense of physical well-being, first of all. And sports helps us to achieve that, you know. It also helps us to achieve a sense of physical competence in the world. That is, we're at home with our environment. We're not intimidated by it.
There is little proof that there is any kind of transfer to real life. It's not because you're playing fairly on the sporting field that you don't cheat taxes or that you don't cheat your wife or that you don't. It has nothing to do with each other because the sporting field is such an artificial field. It's quite separated from life. So it's very well possible that being a good and fair character on that field, you don't see that it's necessary to transfer that to life, because life is so ambiguous in real life and in the ethics of real life. It's so ambiguous that you always can deceive yourself, and there are so many possibilities of self-deception. In sports it's not possible because that's a clear-cut, quite axiomatized field. And the transfer to life, it's not so easy. It's a goal, of course, for the good educator, but it must be a conscious goal.
Sport has a number of benefits that they bring to us in terms of developing children, developing how to get along, how to live by rules, how to play fairly. Those things are taught by sport. And one of the real positives of the recent past is the increase in participation in sport by girls. For years, young women were denied the benefits that come along with sport.
Most of us don't just want to win. We want to go through the process in order to win. I don't want to take a pill and say I've won, right? If that was my only thing, right? So it shows that winning isn't everything. We want the process that goes along with it, right? So, and we would call perhaps a deserved victory, right? If we beat, as I said, use the example of UNC beating the high school, right? It's a hollow victory, right? Or if we cheated or whatever, it's a hollow victory. And so we have the process is as essential as the product, and probably more essential, right? Because it's through the process that we learn about ourselves, that we develop the respect for others, not just the product. It often doesn't matter who wins. I mean, it does, but in the end, that's not really what you recognize. What I think is that you recognize that even your biggest competitors are your friends, right? And that's what's neat about sports. It might be like the biggest rival that University of North Carolina has for women's basketball is the University of Virginia. Okay? Now, it just so happens that I'm probably as good friends with the UVA coach and some of the players and are as well. And that's the beauty of it, right? We compete as hard as we can, but yet we're still friends.
Dr. Shelton and Dr. Bredemeyer both addressed the problems associated with ethical decision-making in the midst of rules in sports which make moral reasoning difficult but necessary. Bill Curry defended the emphasis on winning by linking important values and virtues in the pursuit of victories. He argued that participants in team sports who are well coached can develop character. Professors Hinman and Dwachter noted that special efforts must be made to transfer the values and virtues learned in sports to other areas of life and society. Justice Page and Dr. Boxall both noted how the values developed in sports participation can be valuable when those values are successfully transferred to life outside sports. Do good sports make good people? Determining exactly how to be a good sport and exemplify sportsmanship and the appropriate amounts of gamesmanship at the appropriate times requires a conscious effort as well as a developed moral reasoning skill. From college presidents, coaches, scholars, and athletes, we've heard that sportsmanship, gamesmanship, and character are intertwined, and that if anything, it is good people who make good sports. Have you faced similar ethical challenges? You are invited to participate with us at the Virtual Summit, where we continue our discussion on ethics in sport management at www.philosophylab.com.